Hello, everybody. Here we are today for the second USDA Consensus Fireside Chat with Mike Moore. This is a new series, and today we are featuring special guest Steve Melzer. I'll let Mike offer a little more insight onto what Steve does. But first, before we start, just a little bit about our hosting program. I'm Michelle Littlefield. I'm a program coordinator with the United States Energy Association. We're a nonprofit, non-lobbying organization, and next year will actually be our 100th anniversary. We've done work in about 100 countries with USAID, the State Department, and Department of Energy. So this specific program we call Consensus, we call it for short. This is a cooperative agreement with the Department of Energy, Fossil Energy, and Carbon Management. So this program's mission is to educate the public, policymakers, industry, stakeholders, what have you, on CCUS and carbon management technologies. We do this by hosting webinars. We have a series of monthly educational briefings, conference workshops, reports, and bi-monthly news clips of CCUS and carbon management related updates. So this includes rare earth elements, critical minerals, blue hydrogen, environmental justice as it relates to carbon management, and tribal energy articles to our interested audience. So if you'd like to join, send me an email to the address at the bottom of your screen. So throughout our program today, feel free to use the Q&A button and ask questions. You can use the raise your hand option and we'll get to you when we can. And this webinar will also be recorded and posted on our event page either tomorrow or the next day. So you'll have access to that, but we appreciate you taking the time to join us live. For now, may I introduce our host, Mr. Mike Moore.
Michelle, thank you very much for that introduction. And Steve, thank you, by the way, for being able to be with us today. I had the great honor of having known Steve for 20 plus years in the CO2, EOR, and related areas, and have done a number of things with Steve. I've learned quite a bit by running with Steve, and it's with a great honor I get to have him come with us today. He's for those that know Steve, I don't have to introduce him. He's kind of out. He might argue with this, but he's kind of the Yoda of CO2 EOR out in the Permian Basin and elsewhere around the world. We've been running a CO2 EOR carbon management workshop now going on its 21st year this year out in Midland that was tied into his CO2 flooding conference that started 27 years ago. In fact, the whole idea of this program back then was an early open source process to disseminate the useful knowledge of using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery and other useful benefits as well. And here we are today. So we've got a big movement with CO2 storage kind of moving to center stage. We're talking gigascale type projects that are being announced almost daily now, not just the United States, but globally. It's kind of center stage for any of the players in the carbon or fossil fuel space. Any of the industrials that have any kind of a CO2 emission stream are exploring this as well. And it's a very exciting time to be in this space. And there's been a lot of work that's been done to get us here. There's been a lot of regulatory work at a federal level and state level. There's been incentives that have been done. There's a lot of people who have put a lot of time and effort, hundreds of hours of time and effort into crafting a working space for CO2 to be safely and effectively utilized and to be stored to keep it out of the atmosphere. Steve's one of those frontline pioneers in this space. One of the things we've seen go on around us, the advent of the shale oil and gas development and production, is we're getting a lot more oil and gas production, but we're also getting a lot of produced water with it. A lot. West Texas, I think the oil production from all these techniques and other things are going to top close to 5.4 million barrels a day by the end of the first quarter, and close to it. And with it comes a lot of produced water. And we're starting to see the effects of a massive amount of water being pushed into areas that are becoming fewer in number because of the stricter permitting regimes. This is an issue of interest. You start storing the gigascale volumes of CO2 that we're on our way to do, we're going to get a certain amount of produced water there as well. So the produced water issues that the oil and gas industry has on its own are going to be, we're going to partner up with them with our produced water from CO2 storage. It's a different mechanism, it's a different process, but the water's still the same. And there's things that have begun to happen. There's some things that have popped up and some things we're capable of sorting through them and figuring them out. but there's some very unique things that have come as a result. I'm going to let Steve delve into that. He's the one that's qualified to talk about it. His background, he's a geological engineer out in the Permian Basin. He's got a geomechanics background and a master's in rock mechanics from Purdue University. And again, there's a lot of people that use Steve, his expertise and his experiences in a number of the projects that are out there, and has been involved in a lot of this on the way out. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to you, Steve, and let you do the rest of the talk until we go into a Q&A session.
Thank you, Mike. Can you hear me okay? Good. Okay. I want to thank Mike. I want to thank Michelle. I want to thank the U.S. Energy Association. It's a pleasure and welcome everybody that is online with us. I want to cover some subjects that really a good bit of which is in my backyard here in the Permian Basin, and some of the challenges we're seeing out here with large volume water injection. And I'll cover a lot of other things related to geomechanics too. And I got to thank a few people you'll see on some of the slides, some of the references, and these people I've talked with at length about the things that they see, their perspectives on large volume injection. So with that, you've seen the summary of the course. Here's how I've organized it, and we'll stop at a point about halfway through and take some questions, and I'll let Mike lead that Q&A side of it. But he's covered the energy transition and the drivers and the incentives that we're all feeling that are kind of creating a whole new business in this CO2 capture and storage world. The CCS really is a big set of projects, and they're huge projects, as he calls them, gigascale projects, and the capital that's needed to capture that CO2 where the incentives are. Originally, we thought we might want to put the incentives both with the capturing company and the injecting companies, and decided that probably it's best where the capture is. Now we've got to securely store that CO2, and where do we put it? And then we've got some analogs. Of course, we'd like to talk about where we've done it safely in the past. And maybe now we'll just talk about where not to put it. And the geomodels that we're all creating now for these projects, I sometimes worry that they're not complete. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the geomechanical physics that might be going on that we need to consider in some sites, not in all sites, but Mother Nature has a lot of variability. So we want to be sure we're looking at things that might provide a risk for our secure storage. And then I don't hear much about this, but I want to talk a little bit about the hot seat that we put the regulators in. And they're getting a lot of pressure from their bosses in the legislature to approve these permits for sites. And then they're trying to say, well, gee, I'm not sure that this is a safe place to put it. So the industry that I deal mostly with is the oil and gas industry, and they recognize this challenge that we have of producing energy and producing it with fewer emissions. And I want to recommend this particular report that was honchoed by a number of folks in a variety of industries, not only the oil and gas industry, but others. And it's quite worth a read. The kind of an overview statement here is that the challenge of CO2 capture and climate change really does involve CCS in a large way. We're not going to stop using coal, oil, and gas in the near future, at least. And so if we want to keep that with fewer and fewer emissions, we're going to have to find a place to put the CO2 we capture off those industrial plants. And if there is no CCS, we're in tough places, as this article out of Climate Week suggests. Okay, I want to start with a definition a little bit here. I may be alone in this differentiation of CCS and CCUS, but carbon capture and storage is sort of in my head a capture process that wants to get rid of the CO2 in the ground or maybe make a product with it, but generally just to get rid of it in the ground as a waste product. And then CCUS is when you want to utilize that CO2 to make a product. And of course, the big one is oil, enhanced oil recovery using CO2. And so there we're actually treating the CO2 as a commodity. So there's two big differences there that I wanted to stress as I get further along here. And this just explains it a little bit, but it talks about it in terms of how much are we storing, for instance, when we try to make oil with CO2. And it really is a de minimis loss if we're power's provider for the compressors on the recycle are very reliable. And so we think in almost all of our projects, especially the big ones, we're storing about 95% of the CO2 that we've bought. And we had a problem a couple of decades ago when we were saying we're only storing half of what we inject. And I wanted to point out to everybody here that when we say we're injecting it, we're injecting both new and recycle, but we're storing about all that we buy. And that's what matters. We were trying to reduce those emissions. We have pretty much a fully closed loop. We capture that recycled CO2, put it back in the ground. And the reason we do that, of course, is it's very valuable. It's probably the most expensive part of our project is the CO2 that we have to buy. One of my favorite charts is one that I think was published early last year by Shell, and they were talking about the challenge of carbon capture, utilization, and storage at scale. And this is in the US, I point out. And you see there that we, in 2020, how much we had to capture. And then we take it on out to 2050. And I put both scales on this. In the oil business, we talk about surface volumes, and that could be in MCF, 1,000 cubic feet. It could be MMCF, which is million cubic feet, or BCF, which is a billion. And you see we're looking out at the 2050 and trying to capture and store 50 billion cubic feet a day. And in gigatons of CO2 per year, would be metric tons, about 1 gigaton by 2050. And then for reference here, the current volumes of CO2 storage that we're dealing with in the current CO2 EOR business is about 2.5 billion cubic feet a day, or somewhere just under a billion, 100 million tons, 100 million tons of CO2. So, we're going to have to scale up from the EOR volumes that we're currently using at least a factor of 15 or 20. So it kind of gets you in the scale of what we've done and what we need to do. And then I wanted to show this chart that comes from the Energy Information Agency, and I want to show particularly the change that's occurred in the oil production. And these are 4 states: Texas, New Mexico, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. And what you see there is that we started to produce one large amount of CO2 from our oil, starting in about 2010 with this explosion of horizontal wells. And it doesn't come pure oil, it comes with water included. And we'll talk a little bit about how much volume of water that we need to get rid of. When we drill and produce these horizontal wells, we can't put the water back into the reservoir, where the only way it comes to the well bores is by depressuring the reservoir. So we need to find another home for the water that we produce with the oil. And over there on the left, you can see the various scales. I've tried to make this, and these slides will be available. According to Mike, I think we're going to have these available online very shortly after this fireside chat.
Yes, they will.
Okay. And you can see the size of the challenge there. I've actually tried to make sure we're clearly talking about surface volumes, and we're talking about in situ volumes. And when you're talking mass, like we are with CO2 and metric tons, they're pretty much the same. But there you can see the level of pore space we've opened up with this oil production in Texas, you can see is about 10 million metric tons every year. So these are big numbers. So where have we done it and where have we done it well? Well, as you know, the CO2 we put in the ground is buoyant compared to the water that's there initially. And so we know that Mother Nature has trapped CO2 and it's trapped natural gas, which is another of the buoyant fluids. And so theoretically, we can say just right offhand that Mother Nature can show us where we can put CO2 that we've captured on the surface. And say the geological phases, the issues that we face with these geological sites would be, of course, if it wanted to migrate back to the surface, either by a fault or finding a pathway through an old well, for example. That's our challenge, to be sure that we're closing off those pathways that it can migrate to the surface. But I want to offer up the thought that doesn't get much publicity, and that is that with this large volume water disposal experience, it becomes very important that we not have it migrate down into the crust. Most of the crust of the earth is critically stressed, and so if we add pressure to those faults that are in the crust, we can create an earthquake. And that's where our experience is starting to show. And I'll talk some more about that in a bit. So where have we seen the high volume secure storage? Well, clearly natural gas, natural oil repositories, water floods, but it's a density neutral fluid that we've injected with water, and then CO2 floods with the buoyant fluid. And how have we done? Well, with natural gas storage, there are some documented failures of natural gas moving back to the surface. Some of them were catastrophic. Very few of them, fortunately, were very catastrophic. But generally speaking, we've seen some. They're very difficult to fix, and not the case with well bores, perhaps, where we can fix them. But some of these migration paths with the natural faults to the surface can be damaging. The National Oil Repositories, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, we've done that and done it well. I don't think I've ever seen a documented failure of the oil that's we stored in those repositories. They're not huge volumes; they're moderate size, but they're decent examples anyway. Water floods, we've got a long history of water floods, but again, as I said, it's a density neutral injection, so it's not a perfect analog at all. But we've done water floods for 70, 100 years now. I guess the first being in the U.S. at least was up in the Pennsylvania area, and but very much a big deal in the U.S. And then the CO2 floods clearly is a 50-year history now with large volumes of storage that we've done there, as I documented on that one graph. And I got to offer that particular example, secure storage with CO2 floods, is our closest thing to a storage site with buoyant fluids and a large volume analog. Well, we also intuitively would know that not all storage sites are secure. We've seen a lot of publicity about leaky well bores in old fields, and some wells that were drilled 100, 150 years ago. Yeah, then we need to go and remediate those well bores, no doubt about it. But typically now, what we've done in the oil and gas industry is we fixed those when we found them, and so we look elsewhere in places that the tendency is to want to go where we don't have problems, and the data might be sparse there. So we don't really know enough about the geology, perhaps, where we do in a mature oil and gas field. A few studies have tried to categorize leaky geologies, and it's not very many. I've I had to go back 20 years to find a good study that looked at sites around the world. And these following slides are from an attempt to try to categorize basins for secure storage. And this is the way that they did it. This is a Hitchon publication and right at the end of the last millennium. And what you can see there is he's divided the world into convergence basins on the left and divergent basins on the right. And of course, what that really means is that in the left, we've got plates of the crust moving together. And then on the right, the plates have moved apart. And clearly, when the plates are moving together, we're in a tectonic region. And it may be mature now and all the tectonics are gone, but generally speaking, that's an area that we've tended not to want to go put a bunch of CO2 in the ground and call it secure storage. And as we move to the middle, we're seeing kind of a basin that might be in a shear status of stress, or a foreland basin, maybe like the Denver Basin here in the Great Plains. The Crotonic Basin, a good example of that would be the Williston or the Michigan Basin, some of the intermontane valleys. And I call the Permian Basin an example of that too. And then we have and they're typically evaporite cap basins, by the way. In other words, they got cut off from the ocean supply of saline water, and then the salinity goes up, and the salts and anhydrites tend to precipitate out at the end of the stage of that basin. And they're particularly valuable because they're ductile once they're deep enough, and then they can provide a very, very good seal for vertical movement of the buoyant fluids or sinking fluids even. And consequently, a lot of those basins are very, very large oil and gas producers. Interior rift basins are another example, and the divergent basins there on the right. So looking at this stressed out, you see the categorization there. That's a really nice reference that I could reference to everybody. Another way he broke this out, I found really interesting, is he called the risk of leakage there on the ordinate axis from low to high, bottom to top. Then the degree of sediment compaction there on the abscissa, with high on the left and low on the right. So I have a favorite way of talking about that, where the hard rocks are on the left and the soft sediments are on the right. And we'll come back to that differentiation here a little bit later. But you see the Crotonic and foreland basins are low risk and high degree of compaction, hard rocks, in the interior rift and divergent passing martins, and then high risk and low compaction on the sediments to the top right. I think that gets us to a spot where we could pause a moment and maybe just to collect some thoughts or questions that you might have and address that. Mike, have we had any come in? And do I? Go ahead.
Yeah, we actually had an interesting come in. Michelle, do you have that up in front of you?
You mean the email that we got today?
Uh-huh.
Sure, let me pull that up real quick.
Well, what we'll do next is we'll kind of run into the data. I know a lot of you are very interested in seeing the real data we're gathering in the field today. And that, of course, I'm in the Permian Basin. So in fact, the reason I'm here is because I can get close to the data. And so we're going to talk a lot about that from here on out, but it's a good chance to answer a question or two right now.
Alrighty, so I have one here from Professor Dr. Wim Turkenberg. He is from the Energy and Environmental Consultancy in Amsterdam. He's interested to hear your comments on the recent study by Stanford University, wastewater disposal from oil production triggered major earthquake in Canada. And he attached it here, but I'm sure you may be somewhat familiar or can comment on it. And he's also interested to hear your views on injecting nitrogen instead of water to reduce the probability of severe earthquakes due to withdrawal of natural gas.
And actually, just before Steve gives an answer on that, that particular paper just came out last week, and there had been some other anecdotal events going on out in West Texas over the last few months that prompted the idea of having this fireside chat on this particular idea. So the Stanford piece is actually kind of linked to our interest in this today.
That's very, very good point, Mike. And it was just last week that I saw that article. And it was a study that wasn't done overnight. There was a year in the analysis, and the Stanford people, and I'm going to refer to the Stanford people a lot today because they are, that's where the earthquake center is from Menlo Park, which is now moved to Moffett Air Force Base, I understand. But folks out there right in the middle of this, because that's where they decided to study the earthquakes, of course, because of the seismic risks that they have out there. And so there's a lot of knowledge, a lot of expertise out there. First question was about that Alberta experience, and that's the water that's produced in conjunction with the oil sands oil. And I did a quick study of it myself last week when I saw this article, and it looked like the water cut on a per barrel basis was about 1.5%. In other words, the volume of oil that they produced, only about 1.5% of that water comes with that. So it didn't seem like a huge volume. And I'm going to be talking about, 3x of the oil production here in the Permian Basin with our oil production from the horizontal wells. And so it surprised me a bit. So the next question that I had in my mind was, what were the pressures that they were injecting? Were they trying to hold those pressures down below the original bottom hole pressure, just slightly above it? Or were they pressuring it up and pushing it down and ultimately getting into the crust where the earthquake had occurred? It was a deeper earthquake there too, as we'll talk about here in a bit. So I don't have a lot of information, and the folks that published that were there at Stanford University, and I'll bet you more is going to come out. This is just like Mike said, this is just a week old report. And so I got a map later on I'll show in the southwest part of the US where the number of earthquakes over a magnitude 2 are quite frequent from these water injection water disposal projects. And so we can come back. I've actually got a slide from that Stanford release last week, and I've got that slide later on.
Right.
The Groninger field is really fascinating to me. And I guess what I have heard and read about is that the production and reinjection of water for water flooding has really caused those earthquakes they've sensed over there in the Netherlands. And he's asking the question, as I understand it, were we to inject nitrogen instead of water, would we be seeing those kinds of earthquakes? And I guess the first immediate reaction I have is that, well, water, it occupies a lot of pore space, and nitrogen, being a compressible fluid, will occupy much less. And so what you probably would see is that the pressures in the reservoir would continue to decline unless you injected an enormous amount of nitrogen. And so I don't know if he's after that as his question, but clearly the nitrogen EOR probably would begin to show a decline of pressure in that reservoir. And it's probably a water drive reservoir. I'm guessing, I don't remember exactly if it had a water drive, but based on bottom water drive, but it would tend to stabilize the pressures at a lower level than the water injection would create. So it's a
Steve,
good point.
It's kind of an anecdotal piece of this. Back in December 2021, during our workshop on our CO2 conference out there in Midland, there was a panel session that Mark Sobek spoke on, and he had flagged the issue of the massive amount of produced water that was being injected into fewer places at greater depths and higher pressures. And he actually went so far as to say, not only will we probably have problems, but this particular area, Big Springs, was probably the most likely place to experience this first, based on the studies they had been doing. We all went home, and 3 weeks later, there was a 5.2 earthquake there at Big Springs. And just recently, you had a 5.4 almost in your backyard there in Midland, all along the same lines of this. And again, these are the things that prompted us to be here today.
Anecdotally, when I was talking to you about that one, it was Thanksgiving right before a conference in December, and I was off with my sisters in a town further east in Midland, and I get this note on my door. My neighbor looked at that note, texted me, and said, "Hey, your water's off. I can't go in and check everything." And I said, "Oh my gosh, what happened?" So I drove home the next day and I looked at the note, and sure enough, I had a slab leak. We don't have basements in West Texas, and so slab leak, and it correlated almost to the hour of that earthquake, which was a 5.4, I believe, and so yeah, this was it hit home to me pretty clearly. So
it's kind of an interesting twist. These new electronic real-time metering, you can actually pinpoint when an event takes place at your house when you start losing water or not. That's kind of
I got to tip my hat to the city of Midland putting those smart meters in. They say, water's pretty precious in West Texas. So yeah, we don't want it losing it into the soil.
Well, actually, we do have a few more questions if you want to take a moment.
Oh, let's do the Ben Stewart's got a pretty good one there that's got a little bit of meat on it. That might be interesting. We can push the next ones towards the end.
All righty, so I have one here. Based on what you're presenting, do you think incentivizing small scale projects for a period of 20 to 30 years, which should change the trajectory of CCUS learning curve, would have a positive impact on the development of large scale cluster and hub development strategies and the overall economics of energy and resource transition?
Yeah, I guess what argues against that is we have these big volumes of CO2 going into the atmosphere. So we want to do this in a big volume way. The urgency is there to try to do big projects earlier. But I would say that he's exactly right, or he or she is exactly right, that we have a lot of learning yet to do. And I would like to do projects on the moderate low volume side in various geologies, which the DOE has done a good bit of. But the problem they had was that there weren't a lot of CO2 sources that they could go do big volumes in. I think the one exception might have been the ADM site in Illinois, where they did 1 million tons a year, and did learn a lot of lessons, and a lot of good data came from that. The one that I call attention to was an EOR project that the P-Corps group did out in North Dakota in the southeastern part of like I said, Montana, the Bell Creek Formation, and they did that in a large scale. So those were the two exceptions in the U.S. Now the Norwegians have done some large scale stuff with Snøhvit and Sleipner, and are probably going to do some more. These are larger scale. We're learning from those. So I think there was a big project in Egypt, several more, one in Australia. All of them have lessons. And what I've noticed is that our industry, whether it be oil and gas industry or this CCS industry in general, tend not to talk about the negative side of these projects. And I think that's a negative. I really like when I was studying civil engineering at Purdue, we went and studied every bridge and every dam and every road failure we could find to try to improve the science and understanding of constructing those facilities. We don't do that in our industry today, and I think that's a big negative. That's one thing we've tried to do with our CO2 conference is get people certainly on a panel to talk about lessons they've learned, whether they be really good ones for the industry's sake, or they be really bad experiences, so people can avoid duplicating those bad experiences. So, yeah, the best way to the modeling, as we'll talk about in a minute, is a very complex model for CCS. And we need, I would love to think we have enough time to step into this in a variety of geologies. I'm a site selector by nature, and I know how variable Mother Nature is. And I'd love to say that we could learn more and more, but the urgency of doing this today and tomorrow for CCS capture is really important.
Or just as a little plug for the DOE and ETL, they've got that INRAP program where they do have a suite of tools that they're tailoring to be able to do this with a finer degree of accuracy as each iteration comes to pass. And so it's certainly on their radar screen and others.
Nope.
Just a quick thought. We have large volumes of CO2 that we're going to be injecting. We also have large volumes of water that we're injecting. We have water throw from the CO2 injection that needs to be redeposited somewhere else. But we have the net effect of the volume of CO2 in the subsurface, and we have the effect of the water in the subsurface. We have two different drivers that are giving us issues could be giving us issues down in these areas where both are being targeted. And the one just happens to not only be a mechanism itself, i.e. the CO2 volume, but it also augments the produced water situation as it will have more produced water as we inject more and more CO2.
It brings up a point, Mike, that you make really indirectly, and that is if we're putting a lot of mass into the earth, we probably need to be taking it out in a roughly equivalent way. And that's one reason I'm such a big advocate of EOR, because now we're taking out a product that's valuable that we can sell, and we're storing CO2 while we do it. And we can make a low carbon or even a carbon neutral barrel perhaps by doing that. And if we're just injecting water or CO2 and not taking any fluids out of that same reservoir, the experience we're learning is that it's creating problems. And I don't think that'd be a surprise to anybody on the Zoom here that we've got to do that in the right place. And there are some right places to do this. And we'll talk some about that here in a minute. You ready to go forward?
Yeah, one last comment before we jump is that
Okay.
we're the volumes that we're looking at for CO2, we've not done yet. And the volumes for the water, I don't think we contemplated 5 years ago being these kind of levels in these parts of the country. So it was just, we're kind of moved into we're moving into new territory. We're aware of it, but it's certainly going to have some interesting times for us. And I'll let you go because we're probably at the halfway point. Sorry.
Yeah, to emphasize your point, we could look at that as a negative, that we're producing all this water that we have to dispose of, but it's also teaching us. And so we've almost got a tutorial now on large volume CO2 injection that we need to pay attention to. And that's part of the reason for today. Well, I thought it'd be helpful to talk about all the things that we've chatted with in our conference over the years about where we think the risk for storage, secure storage are. And obviously pressure management, we're talking about that 100 times already, I think. And the reservoir seal maintenance, we certainly don't want it to go up into the USDWs, the underground sources of drinking water. And we've spent a lot of time trying to assure that we will not do that with the EPA and the Class 6 wells and the like. Wellbore integrity, we've talked a lot about that, and the fact that we do need to make sure that these wells are sealed like they said they were when they plugged them many times 50 years ago, and even before what my favorite friend, legal friend says, before law, before regulation. Sometimes they were plugged inadequately. There's several examples of that, I think, in Wyoming, where the wells were drilled in the 1880s or 90s, and were plugged and plugged with non-cement. Let me put it that way. And then some of the lessons that the Norwegians have learned, I understand, has been the lateral continuity of a reservoir where they didn't have a lot of data. And so they've had some pressuring, surprising pressuring up of the reservoir. And that caused them in one case, I think, to cease injection, at least in one part of the field. And so lateral continuity is something we've learned a lot of lessons about with water flooding and CO2 flooding. And you don't have to do anything but drive a road outcrop sometimes to see how variable Mother Nature throws curveballs at you about layer consistency. And then horizontal drilling and transmissive natural fracture lessons. We got smart about this. When we started drilling horizontally, we had areas that we said, hey, there's no faults here. There's just, we were drilling vertically, so we didn't encounter any. We start drilling horizontally, and now we're starting to see some of these, and some of them are transmissive, fluid transmissive. And those are the ones that we need to be careful of. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, especially with regards to strike slip faults, where your transverse faults, or they're hard to find with geophysics because there's sometimes not very much vertical displacement on either side of the fault. And so we found a few we didn't know were there with horizontal drilling, let me put it that way. And then the seismicity lessons. We'll emphasize this a good bit going forward. I mentioned the strike slip in the natural fracture context. Formation overload. This is a word you probably haven't heard before, but back to that one chart that was showing the degree of consolidation of a basin. Soft sediments like the Gulf Coast sediments are one class of reservoirs, and then hard sediments like those in the Williston or Wyoming or Permian Basin are all hard rocks. And those need to be looked at in two different ways. And I think we'll talk about that with the geomodeling section here in a minute. And then, of course, there's non-technical factors. Can you demonstrate to an insurance agent that you can get insurance on a project? And then there's other non-technical factors. Can you get enough acreage? For example, the plume will move out, of course, from your injection well. And do you have all the acreage you need? Those aren't really risks so much as they're expenses that may be able to be accounted with just more money. But again, back to the question that was asked about study, and do small scale stuff. I don't know that we want to do that because we really do want to capture a lot of CO2, get it out of the atmosphere, put it into a safe place, but we don't want to do that in a bad place. So let's see if there's anything else on here. I think that takes care of it. What big water volume injection is showing us some good case histories to pay attention to. And again, on the small volume stuff, the other problem is that if we were to capture a lot of CO2 and say we'll figure out what the security of a injection site is like later on, we may have spent a lot of money and now have nowhere to put it because we've created earthquakes or we created other risk elements that the public will object to. And so all of the things that we're talking about today kind of need to be done up front. So that's part of the urgency of this subject matter as we speak today. Demonstrated secure storage intractonic basins. You saw that as one of my favorite places and one of the author's favorite places to put CO2. And clearly there are several examples of those in the US. There are several examples all over the world. And but even they may not be perfect, as we're seeing with the Alberta Basin and the water injection causing an earthquake up there in northern Alberta. So we definitely need to caveat that. Okay, what are our warning signs? and let's look at some recent case histories. As a matter of fact, our friend from Europe asked the question about the Stanford study. This was March 23rd, the news release. And I think we've said enough about this, so I'll skip over it. But basically, their picture of what happened is really interesting, where the injection well there shown was injecting into the formation, pore pressure increase, and then found its way into a fault that actually they show coming all the way back to the producing formation in the Blue Sky Formation, and then down into the crust where the earthquake occurred. So obviously they were changing the pore pressure in that fracture that caused the slippage, which caused the earthquake. And that was their assessment. And it took a lot of detective work, I'm sure, to figure all this out. The good news was that fault was not vertical, and it probably, they're showing it not to have vertical displacement, so it may be a transverse strike slip fault that was not well known when they started injecting back a few years ago. There's some folks, I call them my go-to folks in the Permian Basin, this B3 group, B3 Insight. And they've been doing a study for me here lately, and I've stole some of their slides. This is a really interesting look at Oklahoma seismicity, where we've been able to study Oklahoma longer than we have the Permian Basin, because they got started a little bit earlier with all the volumes of water they were disposing of. And what you can see there, the time frame on the left, there's 2008 to 2022, and they've identified, the B3 folks have identified, I guess this is USGS data actually here, but provided to me by B3. But you can see the number of earthquakes that were exceeding the 2.0 magnitude, and notice those in black on top. The first one that really scared everybody was a 5.7 in Craig, Oklahoma, just west of Oklahoma City. And then that got everybody back on their heels, and Mark Zoback and his counterparts at Stanford were examining what was going on there, and kind of deduced that the Arbuckle was getting overpressured, or at least pressured over their original bottom hole pressures, and it was leaking into the water was leaking into the crust and created the slippage. He was pretty much a pariah there for a while, because he was saying things that really changed a lot of business plans. Wells that were making as much water as 95% of the fluid was water, and they were disposing of it into that Arbuckle Formation, and they had to change their plans, and it cost them money. And so, but finally they realized that he was exactly right, and the Oklahoma Corporation Commission passed some rules limiting that injection, and sure enough, it started to abate the problem. But they're still having problems. They're not as bad as they were, clearly, but they're still having earthquakes because of all the volume of water they've got to dispose of from their horizontal well continuing work. Over there on the right, you see the epicenters, mapped epicenters of those earthquakes, and there's quite a number of them. I have another view of that here in a minute. Let's jump to the Permian Basin and look at our water handling. I found this chart from B3 really fascinating. There they are. They actually have data going back into about 10 years, where they've categorized the water injection by the type of injection. In the case of improved oil recovery or water flooding and EOR, which was typically CO2 EOR in the Permian Basin, you can see that we were at about 2 billion barrels per year, and that has slowly declined over the last decade. And then the HF is hydrofracking volumes, and you can see that 2020 created a big change in the numbers of the growth that was going into water for hydrofracking. And look at the disposal volumes. It's starting to make the others look pretty small. And then over on the right, you see the produced water. Okay, theoretically, we ought to be producing everything we put in the ground, right? Well, we're not. And so it's kind of really what it means is we're probably adding other sources of water from other places. So now we'll jump to the Delaware Basin, which is the western basin of the Permian Basin. And over there on the left, you see the formations. And what we're looking at the hydrofrac in this particular chart, we're looking at the hydrofracking formations. The horizontals are landing in the Bone Springs and the Wolfcamp, and they're pretty deep. And then you can see where those hydrofracks are occurring, and then superimposed on that is where the earthquakes are occurring. And you see it's in the lower part of that basin.
This lady, all you have to do is walk out the door.
Okay.
Go on.
All right. Thank you. Sorry about that. I'm borrowing his office. And then jumping over here, what we're doing now is instead of looking at the hydrofracking locations, we're now looking at where we're water injecting. And so the excess water we produce with these horizontal wells, we're now looking at the volumes or actually looking at the locations of that water injection. And what you notice is that the earthquakes seem to be concentrated again on that south side of the Delaware Basin. And so I'm going to demonstrate this in another way. And maybe the reason for that is, this is work, by the way, from Zobak and Devori out of Stanford. Actually, Mark is retired right now, so he's really been an asset for really pushing the state of the art and all of this understanding of induced seismicity. He likes to call triggered seismicity. And this is fascinating to me because what he is saying here, they've gone back and looked at the amount of oil and water that was produced out of these same formations that they're injecting into. And note where they historically produced fluids, they have very little seismic activity. And these are shallower seismic events, by the way, in this Delaware Mountain group. And then where they did not produce a lot of fluids in the past, that's where the earthquakes seem to be concentrated. And so the ultimate takeaway from that is that what they've done is regionally the poroelastic effects of injecting a bunch of water with water disposal wells is just slowly raising the pressures in those reservoirs that were depleted in part with the past production. This is another chart from B3, and they've looked at, I guess, part of the USGS actually source data, and look at the number of earthquakes that are exceeding 2.0 with water injection. That mostly, I thought 99% of these epicenters would be due to water injection and not hydrofracking. And so note the black dots where they're 5 point or better. The bad news is those shake you pretty good. The good news is we haven't had anything over a 5, which is probably a source of a need to understand better why we haven't had a bigger one than that. But nonetheless, these are generally speaking 2 to 3s. And look at the concentration of them in these areas. And this is all due to horizontal activity for the most part, and the water injection that's created by the water byproduct. And this is another chart that I thought was fascinating to present here. and trying to get that off of the screen. But the regulators had to get involved. They got involved first in Oklahoma, as I mentioned, with the Oklahoma Corporation Commission. And now we've had OCD, Oil Conservation Division, and the Texas Railroad Commission get involved in New Mexico and Texas. And what they've done is where they've seen these quakes occur, they've gone in and created what they call SRAs or SRIs, or SIRs, I guess, a seismic investigation region or a seismic response area. And there's a whole set of criteria that regulates how much water is injected and how much water, and even whether or not they can inject to a certain formation. What they've tried to do is the big earthquakes historically have been deep injection. Arbuckle in Oklahoma, the Ellenberger in West Texas, and New Mexico. And so what they've done is create a set of rules now to try to control any further seismic activity. And it's working pretty well. I must admit, the regulators have gotten on top of it and done a nice job. The other thing I want to point out down here on the bottom is especially that one out west, southwest area in the chart. Notice that they're starting to line up a little bit, linearly line up a little bit. I want to talk about that. This is a blow up of that area, and this one particular cluster's accentuated here. That was that one right before Thanksgiving in West Texas, and this linear trend really stands out here. This is a USGS chart, and this is the mid-tone area, which is out west. And unfortunately, there's not any people out there to speak of that live out there. I think the town population of mid-tone was 12 when I drove through it last time. So there's not a lot of folks out there, but now it's gotten pretty active with transients coming out there to work because they're drilling a lot of horizontals right there on the Reeves-Culberson County border. But anyway, that linear trend is really interesting. And I wanted to point this out and then actually show you some work that we did in the Permian Basin a few years ago. And we actually named some of these strike slip faults. These are all left lateral strike slip faults there that are kind of running north-northwest and south-southeast. And I added to this some flexural faults that are alongside the west side of the Central Basin platform, where the differential compaction in the sediments in the basin versus the carbonates that are on the Central Basin platform have created some fractures. And there's no horizontal drilling out there in these fractured areas, naturally fractured areas, because of the high water cuts that occur in those wells. But anyway, these Mentone, Sand Lake, Big Lake, Sheffield faults are pretty fascinating. It turns out that Sheffield fault goes all the way over to the Sonora Caverns. These things are big. In fact, a geophysicist I worked with a couple of decades ago said that Sand Lake fault had more than a 10-mile lateral offset. Fortunately, several places it had vertical offset, so they could find it with geophysics. Okay, I kind of jump onto a different subject here. This was an article in our local paper last week, and it kind of allows me to talk about ESG and a social alliance to operate. We have a feeling that the oil companies are great citizens most of the time, and that's completely true. And they provide the engine that makes our economy run in West Texas. But we had an opportunity here where a company was coming in from a different area and saying they wanted to inject as many as, I think it's 28 wells or something, to get rid of water that was coming across the border from New Mexico into the state of Texas. And they wanted to do it near our water supply for Midland. And our city said, wait a minute, this may not be such a good idea. And so that's just right in the throes of being discussed right now. And so I just kind of want to mention that I think the CCS industry is running into some of this, more so with pipelines perhaps than they are with injection. But these are kinds of things that the world we're about to go into is going to see more frequently, I think, because of the large volumes we're dealing with. And I often find a really interesting pushback from CO2 EOR. And I guess the most common denominator on that is that they say, oh, it's just making more oil, and oil's the problem, right? Well, it's a low carbon oil. It's taken care of a lot of CO2 that would otherwise go into the atmosphere. It's got a proven long-term and secure storage history. It's got a long-standing regulatory regime that's worked, and now it's augmented with EPA's augmented subpart RR, which I think has been a valuable addition. And unlike the deep saline projects, we do balance volumes in and out. And if you're an insurance company, you ought to look at this and say, oh gosh, you got a proven track record. Why don't we do more of that versus the thing that we don't have a track record with? That's a little bit of an editorial statement, but it clearly is a baffling piece to me to why we had that pushback. I don't really want to talk about this in detail because it gets into areas that you got to talk about for hours. But the bottom line here is, can the industry design an EOR project to make carbon neutral barrel? And I would argue today, with the addition of revenue stream from storage, that they can get there and probably do it economically. It has to be a cleverly designed project and a big project, but I think it can be done. And now let's talk about geomechanical models. As I said, Mother Nature is quite variable, and we're tending to want to go to areas that have very little subsurface data. But I also want to divide the world into hard rocks and soft sediments. Are we able to model the bottom seals to avoid the crustal injection and possible induced seismicity? I think we're learning that we need to do that. And so we need to be thinking about whether or not these reservoirs we're injecting into have a bottom seal. And then in soft sediments, are we considering things like the formation's consolidation history? In other words, have we pulled fluids out in an area, and has that changed the interface between the formation and the cement column? Does that provide a leakage path? We may be able to fix that, but are we considering that in our modeling? And are we considering formation overload? In other words, are we dumping a bunch of CO2 mass into a reservoir that probably is going to cause vertical displacements or maybe horizontal displacements because we're not balancing it with fluids coming out? And where's the business of storage today? Well, the capture need is intense. The incentives are now in place in the U.S., and I tip my hat to the folks at Carbon Capture Coalition that got this passed, and the enhancements to the 45Q bill that were part of that. And it has created a rush to capture CO2. And that's good. Maybe not so good is, are we going to put it in the right places? We've got a lot of experience with small volume CO2 injection and a variety of geologies, but large volumes is much more important, clearly. And you get into new things with that. Our large volume disposal analogs mainly reside with water disposal now. And then lastly, who do we go to? Put yourself in a regulator seat for a minute. And you got people walking in your door with big project ideas, and they see this enhanced 45Q that makes the project economic. And maybe you got a ton of them coming in the door. I was speaking to the Louisiana folks last year about this, and they said they quit counting at 50 projects that people want to go capture CO2 on. And so they're overloaded, number one, and then they're looking at the modeling that maybe they're bringing in with them, and wondering if they've looked at all the risk factors in that model. And so we kind of put pressure. We put them in a hot seat position. They've got pressure from the company, sometimes the legislature and businessmen in their areas and the states to approve the permits and get the project started. And they're not comfortable that the work's been done to limit the public interface, the exposure the public might have. So it's a tough spot we put them in. And whether you're working for the EPA or you're working for the state regulator, it's the same hot seat. Well, where do you go to get model help? Well, this is just some of my random thoughts, and Mike's mentioned one of these already, that Natural Risk Assessment Partnership, NRAP. They've done some really good work. I think they need to be really integrated in this whole process. And the industry, obviously the industry knows this business. Many good consulting firms are out there that are doing models. The survey, I had a great conversation last week with a guy in Menlo Park, is actually at Moffett now, but and he knows this subject. It was like I was talking to myself. He everything I brought up, he brought up, and everything he brought up, I've been thinking about. So it's really pretty fascinating. They've got the expertise. They just don't have the wherewithal. He said he can only work half time on this subject area of earthquakes, just earthquakes alone, much less the other risk factors that he knew all about. There's probably others I haven't listed here. I think maybe Europe's a little ahead of us in modeling, in fact. So I think we could probably look across the pond and get some help too. So this gets me to the closing, and I bet we're all ready to go on to do something else here. But I just got to walk through this one time with you. And energy reliability is important to a lot of industries and fundamental to economies, and CCS can help provide that. We all want to do more wind and solar, but we also have to have a near constant supply of electricity to our projects and our laboratories and whatever, our shops. And we know that CCS can be done successfully in quite a number of sites. But we're learning some lessons, and let's get them out there and study them and include them in our models. What we've learned, the larger spectrum of site risks, I think need to be included. The storage risks for many, and the sites will require some sites will require exclusion, and that's going to create some horrible pressure on the regulators. My compassion goes out to them. Upfront investments are immense. And confirmation of low risk secure sites is a priority. Fortunately, the secure sites are available, but we may end up finding that we've got to mass balance the fluid injection and withdrawals in some of these projects. We're not planning on producing wells. And then the current CO2 storage in EOR today is about 50 to 60 million tons a year, but we got to scale that up to 50 or 20 by 15 or 20 scale. I don't know that we can do that in EOR alone, so we got to do CCS deep saline too. But we probably want to do EOR in a first mover project fashion, in my mind. Large distance CO2 pipelines are going to be required. And there's some work that DOE's done, and the IRA bill included some of that opportunity to build long distance pipelines. secure storage is proven. Expansion to the volumes needed is feasible. Retraining large groups of geotechnical professionals is going to be needed. And I really do think the oil industry professionals need to be central figures in this new CO2 storage industry. So, Mike,
Yes, sir.
that's where I am.
Oh. This was very informative, Steve. And to the people that have stayed with us past the hour mark, a couple more minutes, we'll let some Q&A go. There's a question that Matt Steele, you've asked about plasma treatment to oil wastewater. We're probably in a little bit of a different segment of the discussion about what they do with how they treat wastewater. I don't know anything about that, but that doesn't mean that that's not taking place. And Steve, I don't know if you've heard anything that wanted to at least get that answer.
Well, this water treatment, water reuse, I like to call it water utilization, is a big deal. And right now, the industry is getting pressure to minimize their disposal. And so they're reusing a lot of water for fracking and drilling. What we have found is that there's a lot of pushback from using it for agriculture purposes. Maybe the next use will be for non-consumptive products, agriculture products, where we can use some of this water that we've treated, sometimes as pure as distilled water. It's not cheap to do, but everybody's doing it. And I had a company talk at our water conference a couple of months ago and said that they're only having to inject about 20 to 25% of the water they produce now. And so they're reusing the rest of it. And so there's a big movement ahead. I don't know much about the plasma treatment that he's asking about, but new ideas are welcome in the world. They're really after it to try to minimize the disposal volumes. And it'll become even more important as we CO2 inject into deep saline formations, because we're probably going to have to produce some of that water out of the formation. So yeah, it's a great question and an area ripe for innovation and cost savings.
Michelle, it looks like we've got a couple more questions there.
Yeah, actually one that I was looking to get some clarification on. Ben Stewart's asking, do you think legislation and regulation should differentiate between storage and sequestration? My question is, does storage in this case imply temporary storage? But I wanted to hear what you had to say about it.
Yeah, I think maybe where he's going with that, Michelle, is that it's commodity versus disposal. And I've always been a commerce related guy, and I love the fact that you can make a product with something that was a waste. We do that with carbon. We do it with a variety of products that used to be a waste product that we had to dispose of in a landfill or something and make a product out of it. It's all economically driven, of course. But if, what we've done by inversion, actually, with the 45Q is we've actually incentivized waste disposal over reuse of CO2 or utilization of CO2. And I've heard there's some people that would like to change that, at least make the table level for those two products, two ways to handle CO2. But the reason that it was done legislatively that way with 45Q was that they saw that they could make money with selling oil, and so you didn't deserve the kind of incentive that you would as you had to get rid of it as a waste. You can see both sides of that, but I'm in favor of trying to encourage utilization of a product rather than disposing of it.
Oh, absolutely. There's a company out there in California that's making fabrics, synthetics out of carbon. There's a company in New York that's making diamonds out of captured carbon and roof tiles and cement and such. So it's on its way. A couple more questions here. Do you think frac closure analysis DFIT, AFIT could be modified to predict triggered seismicity envelopes and optimize planning storage volumes, geometric and fluid?
Yeah, I probably ought to defer that to some experts. I do think that's one of the tools to try to predict this. There's kind of a, if I could take a sidetrack on this a little bit and talk about two groups out there. One sort of feels like more elastic pressurization in the regional areas, the cause of the earthquakes, and that creates a pathway perhaps to the crust. And then there's some that think there's a direct line from an injector perhaps to the crust, and probably both are right. And it basically boils down to, can we find these transmissive fractures in advance and somehow avoid the area for increasing the pressure in those faults? And I think that's challenging. I got some really good geophysics friends, and they tell me that it's really expensive to do the 9-component seismic, which allows you to see these fracture planes in a better fashion. If they don't have vertical displacement, you can see them with a 9-component geophysics. But I'm not the expert on that, and I know that'd be expensive. But there's some really great work that's done by Fasken out in the Permian Basin, Fasken Ola Ranch interests, and they did some really impressive seismic work to try to definitize the shales and the in that area. So getting that data public, and they're a pretty good company for public public articles, let me put it that way. And so I think that's part of our challenge, is to get some of that data that would otherwise be proprietary out in public hands.
All right. Another one from Ben Stewart here. Do you think the energy released by induced seismicity could reduce the magnitude of future tectonic activity?
I hope not. That's not a very good
Short
answer. I know, but if you started doing large volume water injection near one of those major faults like the San Andreas in California, you probably could. I have a theory. Zobek thinks I'm crazy, I think, but I think that the tectonic history of a basin becomes really important in that question. In other words, if you're seismically inactive, that's a good thing. It doesn't mean you're not still critically stressed in the crust to create earthquakes. But if the last phase of tectonics was more extensional, like the basin and range in the western part of the U.S., then the opportunity, this is a theory of mine, that the opportunity for a large earthquake is reduced dramatically. And I'm wondering if we're not seeing that a little bit in West Texas right now, with the 5 being the ultimate. But that's just a theory of mine. He tells me that it's all about the length of the slippage that creates the magnitude. But and he's probably right. But those are things that I think need to be looked at in some more detail and understood. And it's difficult, but oh, by the way, I should have mentioned this already, that he and his wife did some wonderful work on trying to evaluate the state of crust, I think not only in North America, but also around the world. And that's a really nice reference. I think it's on one of those slides that is a good first step for sure.
All right, our last question here. Sorry, you have Mike, you want to say something?
I was just going to say, I thought we were going to be on the windup, but there was one area that about the hard rock versus soft sediments. Did you want to touch on that a little bit more by chance, Steve, while we got you up? Or I know you had some slides in reserve.
Well, yeah, one of the things that has been noticed in the Gulf Coast was that when we didn't re-inject into a producing formation, what we saw was that the column shortened In other words, think subsidence. You're actually taking mass out of the pores. And if the sediment is weak enough, then you tend to consolidate, decrease the volume of the or the thickness, if you will, of a reservoir. And that causes differential settlement. And if it's weak enough, it may go all the way to the sea bottom, or in the case out in the Central Valley in the shallow production out there with the oil sands, they actually saw subsidence from the surface. And there's a good bit of work going on with INSAR right now, trying to understand if we're increasing or decreasing the surface. Are we, from all this volume, are we actually raising the surface of the land? Very small matters, as you might guess, really small, micrometer almost levels. But and then in the case of taking fluids out, are we actually creating subsidence of some sort? There's a lot of work that's been done in that area, but back to the question itself, if the cement column doesn't shorten and the formation consolidates, then you probably created an annulus around that cement column between the formation and the cement column that could leak and may need to be remediated.
Okay.
That's one thing about soft sediments you don't see with hard sediments.
Right.
So
And our final question here, do you know if plasma treatment to oil wastewater has been studied?
I think we actually hit that one. That's the one with Matt Steele.
Matt Steele?
And
All right,
yeah.
sorry, I missed that one.
and unfortunately,
Okay.
I can't
That's okay.
answer that. Plasma, I don't know. Yeah.
We clipped that earlier. I mean, right when we started this session, kind of reworded it just a little bit. Well, I'm done at this end. I don't want to, I mean, we've had people hang with us right up here for a few extra minutes, and my hat's off to them for staying with us. A few of the people that are on, I recognize, and I think they understand the opportunity to have Steve talk open like this on these topics is very insightful and helpful. Thanks to them. Steve, thank you very, very much for taking your time to do this with us and be running with me on this fireside chat effort. And you know, maybe next time we'll do it with a little different fireplace in the background. We'll rotate fireplaces or something. And Michelle, I'm gonna unless Steve, you have a parting shot, word or anything, I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Yeah, thank you
Well-
very much. We'll just go to someone else's cabin for the next one. Just thank you all very much for sticking with us. This recording will be up, as I said, within the next couple days, and the presentation itself will be up probably in about 20 minutes. I'll get that up soon. So our next webinar that we have for tomorrow is the National Tribal Energy Roundtable. This is our 5th webinar about agriculture, forestry, carbon management, and hemp. So this will be tomorrow at 3 o'clock. You can go to usda.org/events to register from there. And we hope to see you there. But again, thank you all for joining us here. We'll see you next time.
Thanks again, Steve, very much.
You bet. Thank
Thank
you,
you, Steve.
everybody. Thanks.